Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Dieter Veldsman, and today we'll be talking about self-managed and leaderless teams. And we'll specifically be diving into what does accountability look like in these ways of work. Welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. I'm joined by Professor Bex Hewett. Bex, welcome to the HR Dialogues.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Bex, introduce yourself to our audience. What brings you to our episode today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a professor in human resource management at the Rotterdam School of Management. Former HR practitioner myself. I spent the first 10 years of my career in HR, took a career change after my PhD, and then I spent the last 12 years as an HR scholar.
What's been the best career advice that you've ever received?
Oh, good question. I think for me, I remember getting the advice to listen more, which is pretty basic, but it was a game changer. And I had it pretty early in my HR career, actually. And I think I've developed that a bit more to think about what it means to attentively listen to people. I certainly know it improved my HR career. And as a researcher, listening is critical. So I listen to people all the time. So that's the best advice I think I had.
I think it's definitely good advice for people to take to heart. And Bex, what drew you to HR as a career, first as a practitioner and now as a scholar?
Oh, wow. Okay, I've got to go back in time. I think, to be honest, my dad first said to me, "You like people, why don't you work in HR?" And obviously I found out pretty quickly that's not necessarily the right reason to work in HR. But I think I'm fascinated by people. And I have this really passionate belief that work should make people's lives better.
Yeah.
And I think people experts in the organization have such a critical role to play in that. And I think in my role as a researcher and an educator, I feel as though we don't always get the opportunity to do that, or maybe as individuals, we don't know how to. And so everything I do is all to help HR practitioners in particular to help improve people's working lives.
Yeah.
That's it.
I think that's definitely something that we can get behind as AIHR, because I think the idea that HR professionals have this massive opportunity to make the working lives of people a lot better. And I think so much influence in what life in organizations look like as well. A theme that we hear a lot from our clients at the moment is the one theme around productivity and the other theme around performance. And it's nothing new, but it seems to me a little bit, at least from my point of view, as if those topics have become extremely popular again, where organizations are trying to do a lot more with less. But to get us started, maybe you can give some context to when we talk about self-managed or leaderless teams, what is it that we're actually talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess they come in all sorts of different flavors, right? So I do a lot of research with self-managing organizations where the whole organization is self-managed. So you do have leaders. There's always leaders. So the idea of leaderless teams, I guess we can get into a deep conversation about what is a leader, right? But the principle is that the team themselves have a lot of autonomy to decide in particular how they're going to achieve their tasks, but also to drive their goals and their priorities as a team. So the autonomy particularly sits with ways of working without a kind of manager to say, do this, do this, do this. But in the organizations which are really go full into self-management, there's also kind of a lot of emphasis on, here's our collective goals as an organization. Here's what we're trying to achieve and our purpose. How do you think you as a team can contribute to that? So they really give over a lot of autonomy to teams.
Yeah. And it's very contrary that I think to some of the more hierarchical traditional models that we used to find, right? I think something that I'm also a full supporter of is definitely around how do you build autonomy and get smart people to make clever decisions about how they contribute towards goals. But why are organizations trying to go this route? What would be some of the benefits that they are trying to unlock by adopting this new way of work?
Yeah, so I think what we see in our research is a couple of different drivers. One of them is a bit more of a probably productivity focused, actually, is as you say, we have smart people, they know what they're doing. Why do they need to be slowed down by a hierarchy of decision making? Why do we need to go up to a manager and back down again? So that productivity driver we see is quite strong. But I think there's also often a kind of philosophy behind it as well. So many organizations just think this is the way that work should be organized.
Yeah.
Why can't we treat adults like adults,
Mm.
and accept the fact that they probably know what they're doing and that they're not going to try and cut off early when they've got work to do? They're not going to try and undermine their colleagues, because the majority of people don't do that.
Mm.
So I think they're the main drivers that we see,
Yeah.
probably.
And I think a lot of, can I call them traditional organizational cultures? I think, try to almost accentuate a little bit more of a patriarchal type of
Mm,
relationship. And I at least experience in a lot of organizations we work in that has definitely started to shift a lot more. Where people are saying structures are flatter. We expect
mm.
people to make decisions themselves, really, as part of that. I want to ask the question, Bex, if an organization goes that route, because obviously there will be stumbling blocks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Actually, I think this is where HR comes in. And
Mm,
what's really cool about the research I'm doing right now is HR just comes back again and again as how
yeah,
important it is, because you have to onboard people really thoroughly into this way of working. And that doesn't just mean sitting in a training room and meeting lots of people, it means testing out and experimenting ways of working in a very safe environment,
mm,
at the beginning of the organization before you're expected to kind of get on with the job. It also means kind of development activities focused around things like giving honest feedback,
mm,
avoiding and dealing with conflict, and also being able to speak up productively about issues.
yeah,
So, all of these things, like investing in that training and development. And then I think another aspect that we see a lot is information availability. So that
mm,
means both passively being really transparent about as much as possible. So, really having information about decisions in the organization, helping people to make better decisions by making sure
yeah,
they can see things, but also then very active, open communication flows.
mm,
So, having structures in place so that people talk to each other very regularly about things.
yeah. I mean, listening to you, I think very much in terms of how do you promote an environment where collaboration happens automatically? How do you promote an
Yeah.
environment where, and I think that's such an important point you make around visibility and transparency of decisions and
Mm.
accessibility of information. Because I think
Mm.
that's where a lot of organizations fall into that trap to say, we'll just implement a new way of work and then, go for it. People will make
Yeah.
it work, as opposed to setting up an environment that really supports
Yeah.
this new way of work, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that way chaos lies,
Yeah.
right? And there's no reason why this should be chaos. We in the research we're doing, we have around 500 companies that we
Hmm.
know are operating in this world, in this way, all over the world.
Yeah.
Lots of different sectors, lots of different sizes, and the really consistent message is that it has to be deliberate, it has to be structured. You can't just say, "Hey, go for it, see how it works,"
Yeah.
and that is slow. You can't, this doesn't isn't just like a really fast change that
Mm.
happens in the organization. It has to be a deliberate thing, and people have to be behind it. And of course stuff goes wrong, but stuff goes wrong all the time. But we don't stop people driving their cars because we expect them to have an accident, right? We deal with the problem when it happens.
Yeah.
And I think it's also then treating people like adults and assuming for the majority of people, the majority of the time, it's going to go well. Let's make sure we have an open communication and dialogue so that we can talk about problems when they come up in an honest way.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think that also leads to the fact that I think your organizational system becomes more self-regulating over time, right? And I
Mm,
think almost the membership and the ownership of how people take ownership of their own work starts to change. And I
yeah.
think where there are some people that don't fit into that mold, it's almost as if the organization works them out. I think
Yeah,
that's good for an organizational culture to also be able to realize who we are and what we offer and what we don't offer.
exactly. It's all about fit. Yeah.
Mm,
And that's why that onboarding so critical,
yeah.
right? Because you're right, it can become self-sustaining, but only if you continue to invest in it. And I think that's why some companies step away from it if they try and it isn't for them. It's why some companies do fail. And it's why maybe it isn't going to work for everyone, because if you're not willing to put in the effort, if you're not willing to make it happen,
Mm.
it's not going to happen.
Yeah, but there's also for me the point that you make around maybe there has to be intention behind it and there has to be certain benefits that you're trying to unlock.
Hmm.
Whenever I work with clients, they ask what's my perfect org design or a perfect culture. I mean, there's nothing like that, right? There's
No.
there's fit and there's benefits and there's limitations and things you need to be aware of in any of these designs that we put forward.
Mm,
But I think something I'm hearing you say very much is around the intentionality behind it
mhm.
and also then almost reinforcing and sustaining it over time.
Yeah.
And I find that people sometimes get caught up on the word structure, and for some reason it's got a very negative connotation,
Yeah,
and
right.
actually doesn't. I had a CEO I used to work with, and she always spoke about structured flexibility. And then when
Yeah,
people asked her, what does that mean? She says, you can't be flexible if I can't give you structures within which to
exactly.
be flexible. And it sounds a little bit like something like that is really important in this
Yeah,
design.
absolutely critical. I'm doing some work on this right now with a PhD student, and we're really looking at what are the kind of boundaries of this. And I think it's about how you think about autonomy, right?
Mm,
It doesn't mean unconstrained freedom. It
yeah,
doesn't mean go out and do whatever you want. It really means, hey, here's some structure. And that structure could be strategic goals, it could
mm,
be the purpose of the organization, it could be your roles and responsibilities. All these things give structure, but then having autonomy and
yeah,
freedom within that, and that's what is freeing for people. That's where people really feel they have choice, because then they say, okay, I know where the boundaries are.
yeah.
Again, to
Love
use
that.
that driving analogy, right? You don't just drive along the road without guidance. There are white lines, so that's the structure.
Yeah, I love the idea of guardrails and guidelines in organizations, and allowing people then also the freedom to know where they can make decisions and where it's sometimes not something that they should be thinking about or talking about.
Yeah.
Bex, I want to shift the conversation a little bit, because as an HR professional, the first thing that I think people will hear is, how do we have managers and leaders that are still in yesterday's way of work? How do we transition and
Mm,
get them into this new mode of work? Because it is letting go of a lot of control. It is also letting go, and you've mentioned the word trust a couple of times as
yeah.
well. But how do you see that transition taking place? And then we'll dive into how HR can help.
Yeah, and it's not easy,
Mm,
definitely. So, firstly, I think maybe ironically, if you're trying to remove managers, or at least reduce the number of managers, you need very strong leadership,
yeah.
because you need people who are champions in the organization, who have authority and power initially to
Hmm.
say this is the way we're going to work, and then to really stick at it.
Yeah.
And not only to say it, but to role model it as well. So what we see in all of the companies that are kind of transitioned to this way of working, the top leadership have been absolutely critical. Like
Mm,
this way of organizing. So we're not talking about employee owned organizations, for
sure.
example.
Spot on. Yeah.
It's not bottom up, right? It is top down in this instance. And I think it's about reframing. So one of the things I find most interesting about the companies we're looking at is what they do with the manager role is they don't just throw it out the window,
Mm,
but they say, hey, if we look at the job of a people manager, it is so complicated and so
mm,
multifaceted. It's almost impossible or very difficult for someone to thrive at all of those things.
yeah.
It's difficult, for example, to clearly direct people's work and manage their performance whilst also having meaningful development conversations, because
Yeah.
those two things can be contradictory. So what they do is divide it up.
Mm,
And so then you have people in the company who are really good at having coaching conversations, who become the
mm,
developers or the coaches. Then you have a whole different person who is very
yeah.
task focused and an expert in that area, who provides the performance feedback. And I think that is really interesting,
Mm,
because it's still, some people still feel threatened, and they will always feel threatened
of
about
course.
not being a manager anymore. But I think it's also reframing as an opportunity for people to work on the things that mean something to them.
Yeah. What it's interesting for me about the point that you're also making is, I think, and you're absolutely correct, right? I believe, especially in your first line manager and your middle management roles, I think that's where organizations rise and fall, right? In
Mm,
terms of how well you capacitate those different areas and the people that operate there. And I think the very traditional, call them, career models or whatever we want to refer to, I think that fails that
yeah.
layer very much, because you're absolutely right. The expectation is, you're great at managing work, you're great at driving performance, you're wonderful being a coach. You might have 1 or 2 years more experience than somebody
Mm,
else, but all of a sudden you have all this wisdom to impart all of the time. And you learn how to play organizational politics and get work done, all
mhm.
literally in
Yeah.
this one type of role. And I think we do expect too much from that managerial layer.
Yeah.
I've also seen it work really well where people have split it out. And
Mhm.
regardless of what you call the different
Mhm.
roles, I also find that I think people then have very different types of conversations, and
Mm.
almost you have that personalized touch around the development.
Mm.
And then you have the, can I say, more assertive conversations around the performance, which I think
Mm.
is also great. And obviously
Mm.
they tie up at
Mm.
some point in time. Um, Bex, how does HR help? If we want to get there, we've got the leadership committed at the top. what does an actual transition look like? What have you learned around the companies that do this well?
Yeah. So firstly, investing in HR is critical. And I
Yeah.
think the companies we've spoken to who did it quite early on, from kind of maybe going from startup and then they were growing, they really got an experienced HR person in quite early who knew this stuff. But I think my advice always when I'm talking to HR practitioners is you've got to start with, what do you need? Asking that question, what do you need? So I think where we go wrong a lot of the times in organizations is HR designs a practice, implements it out to the business. Line managers are expected to make it happen. And then there's just this constant compliance and control process that has to go on. You're not following the process. You've got to follow the process. We're thinking about it all wrong. The question needs to start with, hey, what do you need in order to succeed in this setting? And then co-creating together what a solution to that looks like. And I think the other part of it is not micromanaging everything. So I always talk about HR should be leading through principles, not practices, right? Of course, there are some things which are legally mandated and we need to have a grievance and a disciplinary procedure, of course. But why have a 78-page document when actually the principles can be articulated on 2 pages, and then we talk about how to apply that in every situation, recognizing the needs of the individuals. And I just wish more companies did that. And you see it sometimes, but not enough.
No, I get it, right? And I think, I think from an HR point of view, a lot of us grew up in, can I call it, the process era, where everything was a process or a policy. And there's definitely been a shift towards newer ways of thinking around the role of HR. And I think, that's very exciting to see how that's also evolving within organizations. I love the point you make around leading through principles. I think there's also this idea then that we also try to promote that says, but what is the actual business problem that you're trying to solve with people? Because as HR, you should be solving business problems. You're not solving HR problems. HR is an answer to a business problem that you're trying to get to. And I think to link those different parts and connect the dots for people is also helpful when you try to implement these, can I say, fundamental ways of work changes where you really need the whole organization to get behind that a little bit more. Bex, talk to me about the myths, the misconceptions, because I've heard whenever you use the word self-managed teams, or you even utter the word something like an agile way of work, there's these massive things that come up all of a sudden around what people believe it is. What's been some of the best myths that you've heard?
I mean, I guess the one that's so common is that these companies are bossless, right? And that just does, obviously there's a boss. I mean, there's a founder, there's a CEO, there's a board of directors, whatever. There's always somebody who's calling the shots, who's accountable for the senior level decisions in the organization. So that's, I think, a pretty common one. I think on the flip side of that is the idea that it is chaos, and the perception that hierarchy is the best way of organizing. It's emerged, hierarchy has emerged over hundreds of years of practice effectively. There's a reason that organizations do it, because it works. And so this myth that if you don't have a hierarchy, it's chaos. No, if you don't have structure, it's chaos. So back to our earlier point. And so I think that's probably on the other side of things. And I think one of the myths, but I don't know but I'm not sure if it is a myth, is the idea that this isn't a scalable way of working, right? So there are examples of really, really big organizations who do operate in this way, but they are pretty unusual. That in most companies who are operating in this fully self-managed way are medium-sized or small or medium-sized. And I think the model probably looks a bit different if you get larger, because that's where bureaucracy, that's where hierarchy comes in, right? So that one, I wouldn't call it a myth, but I think it's a common thing that comes up. It's not scalable. And people have strong views about that either way.
Spot on, right? And I mean, a lot of people then say, it only works in a startup environment because of XYZ as part of it. But I think there's a movement, definitely in my view, in like the more traditional org design spaces, I think, towards more deconstructed, decentralized, federated models. And usually those are kind of a pendulum, right? We swing all the way and then we kind of come back over time. But I think it has become interesting that a lot of organizations do want to explore this, and even willing to explore it at scale. Obviously still within the confines then of saying, but what decisions can we make and where should those be made as well? Bex, anything interesting related to industries where you've seen this work, or is it more something that can be adopted in all industries, or does it only work for some and not for others?
Yeah, I think that's also a good question. I mean, on the list of companies we have, organizations we have private, public,
Mm,
not for profit. We have organizations who have been around since the 1800s, as well as plenty of new companies as well, all sorts of different industries. So I can't see any reason why, and I
mm,
don't see any evidence for that this can only work in certain contexts. And if we're talking about geographically, same, right?
yeah.
So there are maybe some cultural contexts which are very paternalistic that you
Yeah.
wouldn't expect this to be a way of working. So, for example, countries like Japan or China,
Mm,
but there's a lot of interest in in those countries from this way of operating from
mm,
certain types of companies. So, I don't think any of these kind of big level factors should be constraining. It's much more to do with the philosophy of the leaders and the way of operating in the organization, I think,
mm.
rather than anything else.
So I really want to ask the question then also, Bex, around accountability, because I can
Mm.
imagine, a lot of people will say, yes, it's all about promoting autonomy, ownership, people making great decisions. What happens when things go wrong? Who is accountable in that type of environment? But how do we still hold people accountable in these types of environments?
Yeah, so I think we can think of accountabilities at different levels,
Mm-hmm.
right? So things that are strategic level, fundamental to the organization type decisions, there have to be, let's say in a private organization, there have to be directors who
Yeah.
are accountable for that, right? And we see examples of companies where they've had to take more directorial control in crisis situations.
Mm.
So here in the Netherlands, for example, and this company's talked publicly about it, so I can also talk
Yeah.
about it. Visi is a mortgage company, and then after the pandemic, they really experienced financial difficulties. And then Tom van der Lubbe, who's one of their founders, had to kind of step back into a sort of leadership
Mm.
role where he'd been away, because actually, if you ask employees to say, "Can help us make a decision about who should be made redundant?" I mean, that's not
Yeah.
fair,
Yeah.
right?
Spot
Nobody
on.
wants to make those decisions. So you need somebody who's going to be accountable for those. But I think on a day-to-day basis, it's the accountability is critical.
Mm.
Everyone needs to know what the boundaries are for their accountabilities.
Mm.
And that needs to be clear to everyone. So I need to know what you're accountable for, as well as you knowing what I'm accountable for. And then we take responsibility for that.
Mm.
But it's also when things go wrong. So a lot of these companies, they use the holocracy model, right,
Yeah.
which is just one of the ways of operating. But there's a phrase that's quite common in there, which is safe enough to try.
Mm-hmm.
And I really like that principle, that you think, okay, but at what level is the risk of this decision? Is it safe enough to try for
Yeah.
you to do something as an individual, for us to do it as a group? Or is this something which we need to involve more people?
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean we have to involve more senior people, but it probably means we need to involve different types of specialists, for example, in order to make
Mm.
a good decision for the organization.
Mm.
So it's kind of recognizing that power and authority come through people's knowledge rather than through a managerial hierarchy.
Mm.
And that's a big difference, I think, in that.
Also drives a very different, I mean, earlier I mentioned the point around collaboration, right? But it also drives a very different way of also knowing where to find people that will have the knowledge to be able
Yeah.
to provide input into these conversations, which
Yeah.
I think in a lot of modern organizations we rely a lot too much on some of the processes to connect people.
Mm-hmm.
There's a phrase that I've heard before that says some organizations succeed despite themselves.
Yeah.
And this plays for me a little bit into how do you almost highlight the informal organization and make that a formal way of getting things done without
Mm-hmm.
smothering it,
Mm-hmm.
as well. I also believe the myth around the fact that accountability doesn't exist in these types of environments. I don't think it is. I think if you
No.
give people the benefit of the doubt, most people, and maybe I'm naive in that, I believe wants to do a good job at
Yeah.
work with the stuff that they are
Yeah.
busy with if they really care about it and it's meaningful to
Yeah.
them. Bex, skill set wise,
Mm.
do you see differences in the type of skills that an HR professional can build in the workforce to make them more equipped to work in this type of way? What would be some of those things to think of?
Yeah, and I think it is things like having adult to adult conversations. So that would
Mm-hmm.
include being able to give honest, critical feedback in a way that's non-threatening,
Yeah.
being able to deal with interpersonal conflicts. Because if you don't have a line manager, you can't say, "Hey, he was mean to me," you know. Not that we do that, but you know.
Well, I think it happens more than you think.
True.
Yeah.
Um, but so being able to actually
Yeah.
have those conversations, those are very important. And I think also there's probably an element of So there's a lot of responsibility on individuals to manage themselves,
Yeah.
manage their tasks. And for newer people to the workforce, that's a skill we learn over time, right? So
Mm.
I think there's also something about helping people when they're new to a role, when they're new
Mm.
to an organization, to make sure that they feel confident in how to make decisions,
Yeah.
but also to know who to ask for help and to have a mentor or a buddy there that they can go to. So I think there's a lot about those kind of things to
Mm.
help people develop themselves at their own self-leadership.
Yeah.
One of the questions that often comes up is when I'm talking to people is, do we need people who are very proactive? So should we hire for proactivity
Yeah.
effectively? And I think that's a really interesting question, because clearly proactivity has a lot of benefits, right? If you want
Sure.
to enact change in organization, if you want people to take responsibility, but if you're only hiring people for that one specific thing, you're probably missing out on a lot of
Yeah.
different
Agree.
skills. So I would say it's more about helping people to enact specific behaviors than having a tendency towards something, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Because sometimes I worry with self-management that it's very inclusive, but it's not very diverse.
Gotcha.
Because there's a risk that we always hire people that we think are going to thrive rather than hiring people and helping them to thrive in these companies.
No, I think you're right. I think it also plays in very much into, in the past we used to talk about the cloning syndrome that used to happen in hiring
Yeah.
practices, and I can imagine where there's almost broader guardrails that almost starts happening a lot more, because I think that there's then certain behaviors that people identify that they think leads towards success in this environment, which might not be true, and there might not be any evidence for it. But I can see how that can start, influencing some of the decisions that we make. Bex, I want to bring it slightly closer to HR. I'm going to sneak in this question because I have you here today. Can HR work in this way themselves as a function?
Yeah, I mean, why not, right? And should, I think. So I think I have a nice experience this from my previous HR career. I was part of a HR leadership team, and I think we were very self-managing in many ways. So there was, a hierarchy. One person was the director, the rest of us were heads of, but we all recognized that each of us had different strengths, partly related to the role we were doing, but also just related to us as individuals.
Yeah.
And we made a lot of decisions then collaboratively. And I think this can work in any group of individuals if you recognize what the other person's strengths are, you recognize what they're bringing, and you also have clarity about these are the kind of decisions that you make, and these are your accountabilities, and these are mine, so that you have that kind of role clarity. That's important. And there's no reason why HR can't do that in the same way as any other kind of organization.
Yeah, I think the important word that you're also using there is clarity, right? Because I
Yeah.
think that's one of the key things that I find that a lot of organizations actually lack. They think they've got clarity, but
Yeah.
they actually don't.
No.
And that's clarity on who makes certain decisions. It's clarity on who needs to be involved in what. It's clarity on what do we say no to. So whether that's at strategic level or at a very tactical, operational level. It's a conversation I have quite frequently with executive teams as well. And I say, what's important to you? Why do you exist? I think HR can work in this particular way. And obviously there will be different permutations thereof, I think, depending on the context, but why not? And I think it would actually speed up quite a lot of things.
Entirely.
But it is a mindset shift, right?
Yeah.
So what do we need to let go of, in your view, to be able to do this?
I think it's the desire for control. Like fundamentally, that's what it comes to, right?
Yeah.
I think it's much easier to manage people in a command and control way.
Yeah.
It's much easier to say, we'll give you a bonus if you perform better, than it is to say, let's have a meaningful conversation about what good performance looks like and how you can get there. And so I think it is this mindset to say, if we recognize, if we start with the assumption that everybody wants to do a good job and everybody wants to feel good at work, how do we manage people in that way?
Yeah.
And sometimes in HR that's hard because we see the bad stuff,
Yeah.
right?
Spot on.
It is difficult when you're seeing all the negatives coming in, but I think it's really important to remember that that is only the microcosm of what's happening. The rest of the organization is functioning incredibly well. And I think then, as HR practitioners, in whatever flavor that is, getting out into the organization to talk to people, even in a non-purposeful way, is really important. So of course, if you're a business partner, yeah, sure, you're out in a business unit the whole time. But even if you're a specialist in an HR team, you should still be having conversations with people like, hey, how's it going for you? How are things? it doesn't matter if you don't find anything useful from that conversation, it's still a useful conversation, right? And I think that we've, in some ways, I think the obsession with business partnering, which is not, of course, nothing new, right? This has been
Sure.
a 30+ year conversation, makes us think that that's a very specific activity when
Yeah.
it's not. And I also think the phrase business partnering places way too much emphasis on being aware of strategic goals and financial goals, and forgetting that actually, as people experts,
Yeah.
it's the people that we need to be understanding and finding out about in the organization.
Bex, I want to start wrapping up for us. Maybe a final question to you as an HR professional. If this sounds interesting to me, where do I start, and what can I do to get this going in my organization?
Yeah, I think it's looking for small wins, quick wins, I would say. So, well, two things, right? If you want it in the whole organization, you've got to start at the top,
Yeah.
as I said. But I think it is also possible to operate in this way in a small microcosm, and then it's looking for maybe teams where this could work effectively, who could try it out. It's also just having honest conversations about what are the barriers towards this, and asking people lots of questions about how they feel things are in terms of trust and these kind of issues right now. But one thing I always say when I'm doing education for HR professionals, you don't need to fix every problem.
Yeah.
You just
Love
need to
that.
know who to bring together and where to find the information in order to facilitate that. And I think that is the important thing to remember. Stop trying to put in place a new policy, a new practice, a new fancy model. None of that.
Yeah.
Get people in a room having a conversation, and that's already a positive intervention.
I love that. I think we get caught up in the mindset of trying to be fixers as opposed to connectors. And
exactly.
very often it's not our problem to solve, and it shouldn't be either. We actually make it worse by trying to make it our own.
Yeah.
Bex, a couple of things that stood out for me, and thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and insight with us and with the people listening today. I think definitely the idea around organizations want to drive autonomy, and to be able to do so, we are exploring new models and new ways of work, but they can only run on trust, and we need to run principle-based organizations to be able to get us there. It's not necessarily letting go of everything that we've had before, but it's about how do we repurpose that, and specifically thinking about what the role of a manager and the role of a leader is within the context of the organization. Absolutely love the idea that HR should also start experimenting and working in this particular way, as well as then it's a lot more about the behaviors that we put in place and how we reinforce them that really drive success in terms of self-managing teams. And really this idea that it is scalable and it's not limited to only some people to be able to experiment with this, but it's open for everyone if we have the effort and the willingness and the intention that sits behind it to really make it work. So Bex, thank you very, very much. Really loved picking your brain about this, I think, very important topic in terms of how the world of work is changing. Where can people get hold of you and follow your work?
Definitely on LinkedIn as Bex Hewett. I put everything on LinkedIn, so that's the best place to find me.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and appreciate you joining us on the HR Dialogues.
Great. Thank you.